The following is an attempt to be as succinct in covering the key bands and albums that made up heavy metal's history and the significant names in the genre as possible. Personally, the only reason I think there's any kind of debate as to who invented heavy metal is that the answer is so obviously Black Sabbath, and nothing else can match them at the time in either metallic might or notoriety, that people try to bend over backwards and be contrarian or undermine the legacy that they indeed have. Not only did these guys invent heavy metal, arguably perfected it, but brought a nuance and a style that simply can't be replicated, exemplified in it taking a full decade before anyone even tried to make an attempt to match their actual doomy sound with Tony Iommi's fat, slow, bluesy, evil-sounding riffs, Geezer Butler's winding bass playing and thoughtful lyrics, and Bill Ward's jazzy drumming played with a ton of power and feeling. The first four are slow, doomy classics with a ton of heft and are wall-to-wall classics, in particular Paranoid and Master of Reality. The next two, Sabotage and Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, broadened the sound and gave them a progressive rock flair that kept the amazing run going. Sure, they lost a lot of steam towards the end of the decade, but those first six albums are immortal classics, not just for metal, but for music in general. People tend to overlook the artistry that they had in those early days, and everyone has at least covered one song off of those early records. The other two notable bands from this time that dropped significant works at the start of the 70s would be Deep Purple and Uriah Heep, bringing keyboards on and more operatic vocals and increased tempos, brought other components synonymous with metal as a style. Take Fireball, for example, an early example of not just a fantastic song, but an early use of double bass drumming from Ian Pace, or his flashy fills in the song Burn. Alongside Tony Iommi, another iconic riff master being Ritchie Blackmore, who started a galloping style of riff in songs like Hard Loving Man off their influential album In Rock. And speaking of that one, Ian Gillan's high notes in Child in Time are another textbook example to point out. Another artist worth mentioning is the Welsh trio Budgie, whose sledgehammer riffing sound pioneered many of the adrenaline-fueled bands, or Nazareth from Scotland, who, much like Budgie or Uriah Heep, weren't heavy all the time, but when they did go harder, they didn't hold back. Now, with this burgeoning heavy metal scene in the UK, you could argue that many American hard rock acts like the Alice Cooper Group, Cactus, and Sir Lord Baltimore may not be as full throttle as the ones over here, but it reaffirmed metal's status, or status as they'd say, as being something more than a fluke. Queen can be seen taking notice of this recent surge of maximalist rock through Brian May's blooming friendship with Tony Iommi. He was a guest at the Freddie Mercury tribute concert, and May showed up on one of Sabbath's albums even when they were at a commercial low point. This admiration can be traced back to the 70s efforts, as on each of their albums, they always included what, for the first time, you could call a heavy metal song on each of their albums. But queened up, so to speak, as it should be. You could apply this logic to Thin Lizzy, they could fall into this category, as could Blue Oyster Cult, UFO, ZZ Top, among others, but there are two distinct bands that would shape heavy metal's sound and qualities from the blues rock of old. And first up, we have Rainbow, Ritchie Blackmore's project following his exit of Deep Purple, leading him to merge with the hard rock band known as Elf solely because he was impressed with the vocal talents of the one and only Mr. Ronnie James Dio, now a metal god, which is putting it lightly. Their second and third releases, Rising and Long Live Rock and Roll respectively, are drop-dead genre classics that form the bedrock of what is now considered traditional heavy metal, prog metal, power metal, and so on. Rising in particular features songs like the incredible opener Tarot Woman, my personal favourite Run with the Wolf, and the utterly spellbinding 8-minute behemoth known as Stargazer, side 2 being comprised entirely of just 2 songs. They were a big step forward for metal's evolution. The only band to eclipse them in terms of sound and influence would be Judas Priest, much like Black Sabbath, another musical export from Birmingham. They formed in 1969, had a bit of a false start with the Rock'n'Roller in 1974, but with their 1976 follow-up, Sad Wings of Destiny, The Judas Priest sound was forged. The sound of metal became more tuned up, the riffs tighter and losing that bluesy feel of old, twin guitar harmonies abound, and extreme vocal dynamics were in full effect, and further expanded upon each one going forward. 1977's Sin After Sin crafted the speed metal template through the title cut and Let Us Pray. Thrash first had its seeds being planted with the song Dissident Aggressor, a song that would later be covered by Slayer. And the catchy mid-tempo anthem Starbreaker was an indication of where the Priest were headed with a commercial spent and a commercial success. As despite an incredible session drummer behind the kit in Simon Phillips, Deep Purple legend Roger Glover behind the boards for it, and a powerhouse vocalist in Rob Halford with the twin guitar theatrics of Downing and Tipton, they weren't a big act around this time and skinny as a rail. Only with the dawn of the next decade did the Priest find some commercial viability by simplifying or dumbing down their sound, you could say, at a time that British steel hit the airwaves, taking more of a hard rock or AC/DC influence. Most rock fans know the hits like Breaking the Law and Living After Midnight, but miss out on the cool deep cuts from before on Stained Class or even Killing Machine. Speaking of Killing Machine, it was around this time that Rob Halford would indulge his not-so-subtle allusion to his preferences and present himself in a way that'll make you scratch your head and go, how did anyone not realize that he was gay? Because before you know it, not only did Priest make strides in the music department, but also through the fashion. Yes, denim and leather. The look associated with this style of music came about through Judas Priest also. So there you go. Already, with the genre in its infancy, you can see the seeds of what Judas Priest was doing spreading to other countries around this time, with Trust in France, Bow Wow in Japan, and Heavy Load in Sweden, all of which deserving listeners some of the first bands overseas to try this kind of sound out. Before moving on to our next era, we have the next pivotal change in what would occur in metal's history, or music's history. It wouldn't come from the genre greats themselves, but through an entirely different movement. That, of course, being punk. The Damned, the Clash, the Sex Pistols, the Jam, Buzzcocks all swallowed up the rock world, especially in the UK. Of course, punk has its own long history and would mingle with metal all throughout both's existence. But at the time when there was a stark contrast between the two, both through audiences and how the bands presented themselves, the primary focus was on the raw, unbridled energy in punk, the concise songwriting, a focus that was largely absent from the disco, yacht rock, and prog music at the time. Metal clearly had tight playing and showy instrumentation as a selling point, so despite both scenes' intentions to excite audiences with confrontational music and socially critical lyrics, the philosophy of the arrangements were a deciding factor on how the old guard of metal would persist. Deep Purple, the classic Black Sabbath lineup, Budgie, and Uriah Heep all suffered as a result. But newer acts like Rainbow and Judas Priest kept going from strength to strength, ultimately eclipsing the punk scene in the following decade. But the band that straddled the line between both styles and succeeded was Motorhead. The debut album came right at the big bang of UK punk in 1977 and had a much rougher recording than anything that came before it. The distinctive bass tone and vocals of Lemmy Kilmister, Phil Filthy Animal Taylor's wild double bass drumming is a textbook in this genre, and Fast Eddie Clarke's bluesy yet shredding guitar was the shot in the arm that metal needed to sail the punk waters and ride this style out for the rest of the decade. Motorhead's full power, however, came through with the next two releases, both in 1979, Overkill and Bomber, both produced by Rolling Stones legend Jimmy Miller, all paving the way for the big success story in Ace of Spades and the live album No Sleep Till Hammersmith. All of this early material helped pave the way for the next significant step in metal's history, spearheading something you'll hear bits and pieces of, but really explode in the following decade, known as the new wave of British heavy metal.